Daniel Cross had become an expert at architectural appreciation during his 6 months on Lumina. The crystalline palace of the Aeltheran Empire offered endless opportunities to study vaulted ceilings, intricate light refractions, and the particular angles of corridors that led away from the throne room. Anywhere, essentially, that Queen Seraphine wasn't. His official title was Human Envoy, the sole representative of humanity's united coalition, assigned to facilitate trade and cultural exchange with the ancient Aeltheran civilization. It was prestigious, it was important, and it was becoming increasingly complicated by Daniel's complete inability to function normally in the Queen's presence. This wasn't about fear. Daniel had faced down hostile aliens, navigated complex diplomatic crises, and once survived a 3-hour formal dinner where every utensil choice could trigger an interstellar incident. He wasn't easily intimidated. No, this was something worse. Queen Seraphine of the Aeltheran Empire was 1,200 years old, which made her young by her species standards. She'd ruled for 1,000 of those years with a combination of brilliant strategic thinking, philosophical wisdom, and the kind of presence that made reality itself seem to pay attention when she entered a room. She was, objectively speaking, the most remarkable being Daniel had ever encountered. And that was the problem, because when Daniel was in the same space as Queen Seraphine, his carefully cultivated diplomatic composure evaporated. His tactical mind, trained to assess situations with cold precision, became embarrassingly poetic. His ability to maintain professional distance crumbled into barely suppressed admiration that he was certain must be obvious to everyone present. So Daniel had developed an elaborate system of avoidance. During formal ceremonies, he positioned himself at the back of the hall. In diplomatic meetings, he spoke to advisors and counselors rather than addressing the Queen directly. When invited to private audiences, which happened with alarming frequency, he manufactured emergencies, sudden illnesses, or urgent reports that required immediate attention. For 6 months this had worked. Mostly. Today, Daniel had thought himself safe in the Grand Library, a massive structure of crystalline shelves containing documents and data crystals from 12,000 years of Aeltheran history. The Queen never came here. This was scholar territory, not a place for rulers, which made it particularly unfortunate when Queen Seraphine materialized in the reading alcove Daniel had claimed, her movements so quiet he didn't notice until she spoke. Envoy Cross. Daniel jerked upward so fast his chair tipped backward. He caught it, steadied himself, and turned to find the Queen standing approximately 3 meters away, her expression unreadable but her posture suggesting this wasn't a casual visit. Your Majesty. Daniel executed a formal bow that was technically correct but probably looked panicked. I was just researching trade precedents, historical context for our negotiations, very dry material, nothing interesting. I'm sure. Queen Seraphine moved closer, and Daniel felt his carefully controlled breathing pattern completely fail. She wore simpler robes than her formal regalia, but somehow that made everything worse. Less intimidating, more real. Envoy Cross, we need to talk. Of course, should I summon the Trade Council, I can have them herein. No council. Another step closer. Daniel was running out of room to maintain polite distance. Just you and me. Is this about the tariff proposals? Because I've been meaning to revise Section 7, and if there's concern about Daniel, the use of his first name, rare from Aeltheran royalty, stopped his babbling instantly. Why are you avoiding me? The direct question hit like a physical blow. Daniel's brain scrambled for diplomatic deflection, found nothing, and settled on. I'm not avoiding you, Your Majesty. You've declined the last 4 private audience requests. You position yourself as far from my presence as physically possible during ceremonies. You speak to my advisors but never directly to me. Queen Seraphine's eyes, deep violet, unsettlingly perceptive, fixed on him with laser focus. I've ruled for 1,000 years. I recognize avoidance tactics when I see them. Daniel felt his carefully constructed defenses crumbling. Your Majesty, I assure you, it's nothing personal. Then what is it? She was close now, close enough that Daniel could see the subtle bioluminescent patterns on her skin that marked emotional states in Aeltheran physiology. Currently, they were shifting through colors he hadn't learned to interpret. Am I that terrible to be around? No, the denial came out too loud, too emphatic. Daniel forced his voice back to diplomatic neutrality. No, Your Majesty, you're not terrible at all. You're. He stopped, realizing he was about to say something catastrophically honest. I'm what? Queen Seraphine prompted, and there was something in her tone, genuine curiosity rather than royal command, that made Daniel's remaining defenses completely collapse. You're overwhelming, he said, and watched her eyes widen slightly. Your Majesty, I avoid you because being in your presence makes it impossible for me to think clearly. Every time I'm near you, my professional composure vanishes. My ability to maintain diplomatic objectivity completely fails. And I can't function properly when that happens. Silence fell in the library, broken only by the faint hum of environmental systems. Queen Seraphine stood perfectly still, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to something Daniel definitely didn't recognize. You're saying, she spoke carefully, that I make you uncomfortable. Not uncomfortable, overwhelmed, there's a difference. Daniel knew he should stop talking but couldn't seem to help himself. Your Majesty, you're 1,200 years old. You've ruled an empire for a millennium. You're brilliant, powerful, and frankly intimidating in ways that have nothing to do with fear. When I'm in the same room as you, I'm aware of every word I say, every gesture I make. I'm analyzing your responses, trying to read meanings in expressions I don't fully understand. And underneath all that, I'm just profoundly aware that I'm in the presence of someone remarkable. He took a breath. It's exhausting and deeply unprofessional, so I avoid situations where I have to manage all that while also conducting actual diplomacy. Queen Seraphine continued to stare at him, her patterns now cycling through rapid shifts that suggested significant emotional processing. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than Daniel had ever heard it. No one has ever said anything like that to me before. I apologize if I've been inappropriate. Don't, she held up a hand. Don't apologize, I'm trying to process what you just said. She moved to a nearby chair and sat, a remarkably informal gesture for Aeltheran royalty. You find me overwhelming, not frightening, not offensive, but overwhelming, because of admiration. Yes. Daniel remained standing, feeling like he just detonated a diplomatic bomb and was waiting to see where the debris landed. I know that's not the professional distance an envoy should maintain. I know it compromises my objectivity. That's why I've been avoiding direct contact. For 6 months. Yes, you've been avoiding me for 6 months, because you admire me too much to think straight. When you say it like that, it sounds ridiculous. It sounds, Queen Seraphine said slowly, like the most honest thing anyone has said to me in decades, possibly centuries. Daniel blinked. Your Majesty. Do you know what people say when they address me, Envoy Cross? They offer carefully calculated words, political statements designed to advance agendas, flattery meant to gain favor. Even my closest advisors phrase everything through layers of protocol and propriety. She looked up at him. No one just tells me the truth, especially not truth that makes them vulnerable. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. You didn't. Queen Seraphine stood and Daniel had to resist the urge to step backward. You surprised me. That's different and valuable. Do you know how rarely I'm surprised anymore? I imagine not often. Never. People don't surprise me because they're too busy trying to tell me what they think I want to hear. She moved closer, and Daniel forced himself to hold his ground. But you avoided me because you couldn't maintain your professional facade. That's either refreshingly honest or spectacularly terrible at diplomacy. Probably both, Daniel admitted. For the first time in their entire acquaintance, Queen Seraphine smiled. Not the formal, diplomatic expression she showed in public, but something smaller, more genuine. I like honesty, Envoy Cross, even when it's awkward. She paused. Especially when it's awkward, because awkward honesty is difficult to fake. So I'm not fired, sent back to Earth in diplomatic disgrace. No, though I do have a question. Your Majesty, this admiration that overwhelms you, what specifically triggers it? My appearance, my status, some aspect of Aeltheran culture you find exotic. Daniel considered lying, then realized he'd already passed the point where diplomatic evasion was possible. Your mind, the way you think about problems. I've read transcripts of your philosophical treatises. I've studied your diplomatic resolutions to conflicts that should have been unsolvable. You don't just rule. You understand systems at a level I can barely comprehend. He gestured helplessly. That's what overwhelms me. Not your appearance, though you're objectively striking by any species standards. Not your power, though you have plenty. It's your mind, the sheer scope of your intelligence and how you apply it. Queen Seraphine's bioluminescent patterns had shifted to warm gold, an emotional state Daniel suddenly very much wanted to understand. 1,200 years, she said softly, and I don't think anyone has ever complimented my mind before. My leadership, yes. My strategic thinking, my diplomatic skills, but my mind, the way I think, She paused. That's remarkably specific. I'm a researcher by training. Before I went into diplomatic service, I studied xenopsychology, how different species approach problem solving. Your thought processes are fascinating. I'm being analyzed. Everyone's always being analyzed by me. It's how I process social interaction. Daniel smiled slightly. The difference is that when I analyze you, I'm usually too impressed to remember what conclusions I drew. Queen Seraphine laughed, a genuine sound that made her seem suddenly younger than her 1,200 years. So I scramble your analytical processes through sheer impressiveness. Essentially, yes. She searched for words. That's actually rather flattering, in a strange way. I'm glad you're taking it well. I was genuinely worried this conversation would end my diplomatic career. It might have if you'd lied. Queen Seraphine moved toward the library's exit, then paused. Envoy Cross, I'm going to make a request, one you're free to decline. Your Majesty, stop avoiding me. I understand the professional challenges it creates for you, but I'd like to address them directly rather than through 6 months of elaborate evasion tactics. She looked back at him. I rarely get to speak with people who are genuinely honest rather than calculatedly diplomatic. You might find that if you actually spent time in my presence, the overwhelming feeling would diminish. Or get worse, Daniel said before he could stop himself. Then we'll deal with worse, but I'd like to try. She smiled again. Besides, if your analysis of my thinking is as insightful as you claim, I could use another perspective on some current problems. Consider it a diplomatic assignment. Provide honest assessment rather than politically convenient agreement. Daniel felt his careful avoidance strategy crumbling. But underneath the anxiety, something else stirred, curiosity. The chance to actually engage with Queen Seraphine beyond formal protocols. I accept, he heard himself say, on one condition. Her eyebrows rose. A human envoy conditions his queen, bold. If I'm supposed to be honest rather than diplomatic, I need permission to be occasionally inappropriate. Within reason. Queen Seraphine studied him for a long moment. Then, granted, within reason. After she left, Daniel stood alone in the library, trying to process what had just happened. He'd confessed to avoiding the queen because he was too impressed by her to function normally. And instead of disaster, she'd invited him to spend more time with her. This was either going to be the best or worst development of his diplomatic career, possibly both. The invitation came the next morning. Queen Seraphine requested Envoy Cross's presence for an informal discussion in her private study. Not the throne room, not a formal audience chamber. her personal space. Daniel spent 20 minutes trying to decide what to wear, eventually settling on his standard diplomatic attire on the grounds that at least it was familiar. When he arrived at the designated location, a surprisingly modest room filled with books, data crystals, and what appeared to be the Aeltheran equivalent of houseplants, the Queen was already present, dressed more casually than he'd ever seen her. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing to a chair. "I wasn't certain you would. You're the Queen. When you invite someone, they generally come. You've been declining my invitations for 6 months." "Fair point." Daniel sat, acutely aware of the informality of the situation. "Your Majesty, I have to ask, why? Why invite someone who can barely string 2 coherent thoughts together in your presence to have informal discussions?" "Because you're honest when you can't string coherent thoughts together. And I'm curious what happens when you've had time to process the fact that I'm just a person." She poured something from a crystal decanter, Aeltheran equivalent of tea, Daniel had learned. "Do you drink stimulants?" "Constantly. It's how I survive diplomatic functions." She smiled and poured a second cup. "Then we have something in common already." They talked for 2 hours. Or rather, Queen Seraphine asked questions and Daniel found himself answering with less and less filtering. About human culture, about his background in xenopsychology, about how he'd ended up in diplomatic service when his first love was research. "I liked understanding how minds worked," he explained. "Different species, different cognitive frameworks, but the funding dried up and diplomatic service paid better. Turned out I was decent at talking to aliens." "Except me." "Except you," Daniel agreed. "You're an outlier in the dataset." "Is that good or bad?" "Terrifying but interesting." Queen Seraphine laughed, and Daniel felt something shift. She wasn't just the queen in this space, she was Seraphine, a person with her own curiosity and wry humor. "Can I ask you something?" he said, emboldened by 2 hours of surprisingly easy conversation. "Please." "What's it like? Living for 1,200 years. I can barely plan for my next decade." Seraphine was quiet for a moment, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to contemplative blue. "Exhausting sometimes. You accumulate so much history. So many decisions that had consequences you're still living with, people you've lost, changes you've witnessed." She looked at him. "But also beautiful, watching civilizations grow, learning things that take centuries to understand. Finding new surprises, even when you think you've seen everything. Like humans showing up on your diplomatic doorstep. Like humans confessing they avoid me because they admire me too much." She smiled. "That was definitely a surprise." "Glad I could contribute to your experiential database." "Daniel, may I call you Daniel in private?" "Of course, Your Majesty." "Then call me Seraphine. The honorifics get tiresome when we're having actual conversations." That small permission felt monumental. "Seraphine, then, can I ask, yesterday when I explained why I'd been avoiding you, what did you actually think?" "Honestly, I was stunned." Seraphine set down her cup. "For 6 months I assumed you disliked me, or found Aeltheran customs disturbing, or harbored some political agenda that required maintaining distance. To learn it was admiration." She paused. "No one sees me as overwhelming in a positive sense. I'm powerful, yes. Intimidating, certainly. But overwhelming because someone values my mind too highly. That's new." "It probably shouldn't be," Daniel said. "You're remarkable." "You keep saying that." Her patterns shifted to something warm and golden again. "But you say it like it's observable fact rather than political flattery." "It is observable fact. I could cite specific examples." "Please don't. My ego doesn't need detailed documentation." But she was smiling. "Though I admit, having someone analyze my thinking with genuine interest rather than political calculation is pleasant, different." They fell into a pattern over the following weeks. Regular informal meetings where Daniel and Seraphine discussed everything from philosophy to interstellar politics to the inexplicable human obsession with caffeinated beverages. Daniel's initial overwhelming response to her presence didn't disappear, but it evolved. He stopped feeling like he was drowning in impressiveness and started feeling like he was having fascinating conversations with someone he genuinely enjoyed. But the palace noticed. The queen spends considerable time with the human envoy, Lord Erendor observed during a council meeting Daniel wasn't present for. This is unusual. The queen may spend time with whomever she wishes, another counselor replied. Of course, but appearances matter. People are beginning to talk. Let them talk, Seraphine said coolly. Envoy Cross provides valuable perspective on human thought processes. Our alliance with humanity is important enough to warrant direct engagement. Direct engagement could be achieved through formal channels, Your Majesty. These private meetings appear. Erendor chose his words carefully. Informal. They are informal, that's the point. Seraphine's tone carried warning. I will not be questioned on my choice of advisors, Lord Erendor. But despite her dismissal, the whispers continued. The queen and the human envoy, too much time together, improper closeness, potential scandal. Daniel heard the rumors through his own networks and confronted Seraphine directly. I'm causing problems for you, he said during one of their meetings. The nobility is concerned about how much time you're spending with me. The nobility is always concerned about something. It's their primary function. Seraphine, I'm serious. If my presence here is creating political complications, your presence here is providing me with the first genuine intellectual stimulation I've had in decades. The political complications can adapt. She studied him. Unless you want to stop, return to formal diplomatic distance. Daniel considered it for exactly 2 seconds. No, I don't want to stop. Then we won't. Seraphine's certainty was absolute. I'm 1,200 years old, Daniel. I've navigated more complicated political situations than nobles gossiping about my choice of company. Let them whisper. But 2 weeks later, the whispers escalated into formal challenge. Lord Erendor, backed by several conservative nobles, submitted a petition to the Queen. Reconsider her close association with the human envoy, as it presented concerns about royal dignity and proper protocol. Seraphine's response was swift and cutting. She called a full council meeting, everyone present, no exceptions, and addressed the petition publicly. It has come to my attention, she said, voice carrying the full weight of royal authority, that some among you have concerns about my interactions with Envoy Cross. You've submitted formal objections, citing propriety and tradition. She paused, letting the tension build. I acknowledge your concerns, and I reject them entirely. Murmurs rippled through the council chamber. For 1,000 years, I have ruled according to tradition and propriety. I have maintained appropriate distance. I have conducted myself as previous rulers did, with all the isolation that implies. Seraphine's gaze swept the assembled nobles. And in that time, I have been surrounded by advisors and counselors who tell me what they think I wish to hear, who phrase every statement through layers of protocol, who treat me as a symbol rather than a person. Envoy Cross does none of those things. He speaks honestly, sometimes awkwardly, always directly. He challenges my assumptions. He provides perspectives that genuine rather than calculated. And in doing so, he makes me a better ruler. Because a leader who is never honestly challenged becomes stagnant. Lord Erendor stood. Your Majesty, we mean no disrespect. We simply worry. About appearances, I know. Seraphine's expression was ice. Here's what you should worry about instead. What kind of ruler values appearance over growth? What kind of leader surrounds herself only with yes men and protocol enforcers? She looked directly at Erendor. I have led this empire for a millennium. I have earned the right to choose my own advisors and companions. If you find that concerning, perhaps you should examine why honesty threatens you. The silence that followed was absolute. This council is dismissed, Seraphine said. And Lord Erendor, I'll expect your apology by end of day. Not to me, to Envoy Cross for questioning his integrity. Later, Daniel found Seraphine in her private gardens, a space he'd been given rare access to. That was intense, he said. That was necessary. She looked tired in a way he'd never seen. They needed to understand that I won't be controlled through social pressure. You defended me, publicly. I defended truth. You just happen to embody it at present. She smiled slightly. Though yes, I defended you specifically. Because Daniel, in 6 months, no, in 1,000 years, you're the first person who's made me feel like something other than a title. Seraphine, let me finish. She turned to face him fully. I know this is complicated. I know there are power dynamics and political implications and probably a dozen reasons why this. She gestured between them. Whatever this is becoming is impractical, but I don't care. You make me feel alive in ways I'd forgotten were possible, and I'm not going to apologize for valuing. Daniel felt something break open in his chest. I don't know what this is either, but I know I've never met anyone like you, and I know that trying to maintain diplomatic distance from you was the most pointless 6 months of my life. So what do? We figure it out as we go, Daniel offered. No protocol, no predetermined path, just honesty and seeing where it leads. That's terrifying, Seraphine said. It really is. But also exciting. That too. They stood in the garden as the light of Lumina's sun painted the crystalline architecture in shades of amber and rose. And for the first time in her 1,200-year life, Queen Seraphine felt uncertain about the future. It was wonderful. The formal designation came 3 days later. Envoy Daniel Cross was appointed personal advisor to the Queen on matters of human-Aeltheran relations. It was an unprecedented position, essentially creating a role that had never existed before in the Empire's 12,000-year history. The response was mixed. Progressive nobles viewed it as Queen Seraphine's characteristic forward thinking, bringing fresh perspective into the traditionally insular royal court. Conservative factions saw it as inappropriate elevation of an outsider to intimate proximity with royal authority. Daniel found himself navigating political currents he was only partially equipped to handle. At least twice a week, someone would approach him with carefully worded questions designed to assess his intentions, his loyalty, or how much influence he actually wielded with the Queen. They think I'm manipulating you, he told Seraphine during one of their evening discussions, or that you've lost your judgment. Let them think what they wish. I know the truth. Which is that I finally have someone I can talk to without translating every thought through diplomatic filters. Seraphine handed him a data crystal. I've been working on educational reforms. Read this and tell me honestly if it's politically naive or genuinely progressive. Daniel spent the next hour reading while Seraphine worked on other matters. This had become their pattern. Comfortable coexistence where silence didn't need to be filled and work could happen alongside conversation. It's brilliant, he finally said, but you're going to face massive resistance from the traditional academic institutions. You're essentially dismantling a system that's been in place for millennia. I know, is it worth the fight? Do you think it will genuinely improve Aeltheran society? Yes, then it's worth the fight. Daniel set down the crystal. But Seraphine, you're going to need broader support than just me telling you it's a good idea. You need allies in the educational sector, respected scholars who can advocate. I know, I have people working on that. She looked at him with something that might have been affection, but I wanted your assessment first, before the political calculations begin. Why? I'm a xenopsychologist turned diplomat. I'm not an expert in Aeltheran educational systems. No, but you're an expert in seeing systems clearly. And you don't have political stakes in maintaining status quo. Seraphine moved to sit beside him, a casual proximity that would have been impossible 6 months ago. That's what I value, Daniel. Your ability to assess situations without agenda. I have an agenda, Daniel said quietly. I want you to succeed. That's not objective. It's honest, there's a difference. They were interrupted by urgent summons. A crisis developing in the outer systems. a territorial dispute between Aeltheran colonists and a neighboring species that was escalating toward military confrontation. The next 36 hours were chaos. War room meetings, diplomatic channels, military assessments. Daniel found himself working alongside Seraphine and her strategic advisors, offering perspectives on human conflict resolution approaches when relevant. During Hour 28, with everyone exhausted and tensions high, Lord Urindor made a cutting remark about relying on human sentiment rather than Aeltheran logic to solve Aeltheran problems. Actually, Daniel said before he could stop himself, sentiment and logic aren't opposites. Humans have resolved conflicts through emotional appeals that created conditions for logical agreements. Dismissing that approach because it's not traditionally Aeltheran is itself illogical. The room went silent. You didn't contradict Lord Urindor in council meetings, especially not if you were an outsider. Envoy Cross raises a valid point, Seraphine said into the silence. Continue. Daniel explained the concept of empathetic negotiation, creating emotional connection before attempting logical resolution. Several older advisors looked skeptical, but younger counselors seemed intrigued. The crisis was eventually resolved through a combination of approaches, traditional Aeltheran diplomatic pressure combined with the kind of personal appeal Daniel had suggested. It wasn't perfect, but it prevented war. You defended me again, Daniel told Seraphine after the final meeting concluded, in front of the entire Strategic Council. You had a valid point. Urindor will hate me even more now. Urindor hates change. You represent change. His opinion was predetermined. Seraphine looked exhausted, the kind of tired that came from extended high-stakes decision-making. Daniel, can I ask you something honestly? Always. Are you happy here, in this position? Because I know I've essentially trapped you in the center of political conflicts you never signed up for. Daniel thought carefully. I miss research sometimes. Miss the simplicity of studying systems without being inside them. But he met her eyes. I've never been more intellectually stimulated or more fulfilled by what I'm doing. So yes, I'm happy. Even when Urindor looks like he wants to have me assassinated. If he tries, I'll have him removed. That's both comforting and slightly concerning that we're casually discussing assassination attempts. Seraphine smiled, that genuine expression that still felt like a privilege to witness. Welcome to palace life. But the assassination concern turned out to be less joke than Daniel realized. 3 weeks later, during a formal reception, someone spiked his drink with a substance that would have been fatal to human physiology. He didn't drink it. Aeltheran ceremonial beverages tasted terrible to human palates, so he'd learned to sip minimally and discreetly avoid most consumption. But the intent was clear. The investigation was swift and brutal. The perpetrator was identified, not Urindor himself, but someone from his faction. The punishment under Aeltheran law was severe. I want to press charges, Seraphine told Daniel. This was an attack on a diplomatic representative under my personal protection. It's essentially treason. If you press charges, it escalates this conflict into something massive. Urindor's entire faction will become permanently hostile. Daniel was still shaken but thinking tactically. Is that the fight you want right now? Someone tried to kill you. Someone tried to remove your human advisor. There's a difference. Daniel could see Seraphine's anger. Her bioluminescent patterns were storming through harsh reds and sharp oranges. Seraphine, I know you're furious. I am too. But think strategically. If you make this a huge public issue, I become even more of a political lightning rod. Every decision you make involving human relations gets scrutinized through the lens of she's protecting her pet human. You're not my pet. I know that, you know that, but that's how it will be framed. Daniel took her hand, a gesture that still felt momentous every time. Let's be smart about this. Quiet investigation, decisive punishment, but don't turn it into political theater. Seraphine's pattern slowly calmed. I hate that you're right. It's one of my less endearing qualities. No, it's exactly why I need you here. You think 3 moves ahead even when you're the one at risk. The would-be assassin was quietly exiled to a remote colony. Erendor received a formal censure that damaged his political standing without creating martyrdom. And Daniel gained a security detail he hadn't wanted but couldn't refuse. "I'm being followed by guards now," he complained to Seraphine. "It's weird. It's necessary. Though I admit the guards are somewhat unnecessary when you're with me. I'm perfectly capable of protecting you." That's simultaneously touching and concerning. Should I be worried about you having to protect me? Only if you plan on more assassination attempts. I'll try to keep those to a minimum. They were having this conversation in Seraphine's private quarters, another boundary that had gradually dissolved. Not her bedroom, but her study, her gardens, her informal spaces. Places no one else accessed. "Daniel," Seraphine said suddenly, her tone shifting, "I need to tell you something." "That sounds ominous." "It's not, or maybe it is, I'm not certain." She set down the report she'd been reviewing. "Us, whatever we're building here. It's significant to me. More than I expected. More than is probably wise for a ruler to invest in a single relationship." "Seraphine, let me finish. You're human. Your lifespan is a fraction of mine. In 80 years, maybe less, you'll be gone. And I'll still be here, ruling, living, continuing for potentially thousands more years." Her patterns had gone to deep blue sadness, Daniel had learned. "I'm setting myself up for loss. And yet I can't seem to care enough to stop." Daniel felt his chest tighten. He'd been avoiding thinking about the lifespan disparity, but she was right. It was fundamental and unavoidable. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "I can't promise I'll live longer. I can't fix the basic biological incompatibility of our species." "I know, I'm not asking you to." Seraphine moved closer. "I'm just acknowledging reality. And deciding that even with that reality I want this, whatever this is, for however long we have. Even though it ends with loss. All things end, Daniel. The question is whether the connection is worth the inevitable loss." She took his hands. "And you are worth it, even knowing how this eventually resolves. You're remarkably fatalistic for someone who's immortal. I prefer realistic. And realistically, I have centuries of loneliness ahead of me. I'd rather have decades of genuine connection, followed by grief, than deny myself this because I'm afraid of future pain." Daniel pulled her into an embrace. Another boundary crossed, physical comfort becoming natural between them. "Then we make the most of the time we have." "Yes," Seraphine agreed, "we do." Outside the windows, luminous sunset painted the sky in shades of violet and gold. Inside, 2 beings from different worlds, different lifespans, different everything, held each other and chose connection despite every logical argument against it. Because some things were worth the inevitable pain. And some people were worth every moment you could steal from an indifferent universe. 5 years passed. The relationship between Queen Seraphine and advisor Daniel Cross became an accepted reality of palace life, not without its critics, but established enough that active opposition had faded into background grumbling. Daniel had aged visibly, lines around his eyes, threads of gray in his hair. Seraphine remained unchanged, as she would for centuries, the physical manifestation of their fundamental incompatibility. They didn't talk about it often, but it was always there, the awareness that every year brought Daniel closer to his limited end, while Seraphine barely registered the passage of time. The relationship itself had evolved beyond easy categorization. More than friendship, but not romantic in traditional sense. They were partners in the truest meaning, intellectually, emotionally, politically. The physical component existed but was secondary to the profound meeting of minds. "I'm going to retire," Daniel announced one evening. "From diplomatic service. I've arranged for a replacement envoy." Seraphine looked up sharply from her work. "Why?" "Because I'm 52 years old and I'm tired." Daniel smiled at her expression. "Not of you, never of you, but of the political games, the constant vigilance, the assassination attempt prevention lifestyle. I want to do research again. Actual study of Aeltheran cognitive development, which you've given me unprecedented access to examine. You'd stay on Lumina, if you'll have me, as a scholar rather than advisor. Someone who bothers you with research questions instead of political analysis. I'll have you in any capacity you choose, Seraphine said, though I'll miss your political insight. You have an entire council for political insight. You don't need me for that anymore. Daniel moved to sit beside her, but I'd like to spend my remaining years actually contributing to xenopsychological understanding rather than playing diplomatic chess. Your remaining years. Seraphine's voice was quiet. You talk about that more frequently now. Because I'm aware of them. I'm past middle age for humans, Seraphine. I have maybe 30 years left if I'm lucky and take care of myself. That's not very long. It's forever when I think about losing you. Then don't think about it. Think about the 30 years we have now. The transition from advisor to scholar in residence happened smoothly. Daniel moved into research quarters, established himself with the Aeltheran academic community, and began the work he'd always wanted to do, comprehensive study of how millennial lifespans shaped Aeltheran cognitive development and cultural frameworks. He still saw Seraphine regularly. Dinners, discussions, companionable time that was less politically fraught and more genuinely personal. I like this better, Daniel admitted one evening. No one trying to assassinate me. No political factions to navigate, just research and you. I like it too, Seraphine said, though I miss having you in council meetings. My current advisors are considerably less willing to call me out when I'm being politically blind. Train them better. I trained you. You absolutely did not. I was like this when you met me. You just finally heard it instead of me avoiding you. Because you were overwhelmed by my impressive mind. Still am, Daniel said easily. Just better at functioning despite it. At 65, Daniel began showing more serious signs of aging. Movement slower, health requiring more maintenance. Seraphine watched with the helpless awareness that she was completely powerless against time. I've been researching human lifespan extension, she told him. Aeltheran medical technology is more advanced than human. We might be able to give you another 20 years, maybe more. Seraphine, I know it doesn't solve the fundamental disparity, but 20 more years is 20 more years. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Would it be for my benefit or yours? Does it matter? Yes, because I don't want to extend my life artificially just so you don't have to deal with loss. That's not living, that's postponing grief. Then do it because I'm selfishly asking for more time with you. That's more honest. Daniel took her hand. Show me the research. If it doesn't significantly reduce my quality of life, I'll consider it. The treatments were intensive but effective. At 70, Daniel had the health markers of a 50-year-old human. His mind remained sharp, his mobility better than expected. Aeltheran medical science had bought them time, but time, ultimately, ran out anyway. At 89, Daniel's system began failing in ways that no treatment could reverse. Multiple organ stress, neural degradation, the inevitable cascade of human biological limitation. Seraphine was with him in his final months. Not as queen, she'd temporarily delegated significant responsibilities to her council. But as herself, with the person who'd made her remember what it meant to be more than a title. I don't regret it, Daniel said one evening, his voice weaker than it had been. Any of it. Confessing why I avoided you. The years as advisor, the research, all of it. Neither do I, Seraphine sat beside his bed, holding his hand. You taught me to live, Daniel, really live. Not just exist through centuries, but actually feel each moment. That's a lot of pressure to put on one awkward human who couldn't stop staring at you in the library. You weren't awkward. You were honest. That was the gift. I love you, Daniel said. Not romantic declaration, but simple truth. Not in the way humans usually mean it, but in all the ways that matter. I know I love you too, in all the ways that matter. Daniel died 3 days later in Seraphine's presence, having lived longer and better than most humans managed. The funeral was state affair, recognition of someone who'd served the empire and influenced its ruler. But Seraphine's private grief was beyond ceremony. For 1,200 years, she'd been untouched by personal loss. Advisors died, friends aged away, but she'd maintained distance that protected her from real grief. Daniel had destroyed that distance, and now she understood why she'd avoided it for so long. Loss hurt. It hurt in ways that her long existence hadn't prepared her for. But as she stood in her gardens, the space where Daniel had spent so much time, Seraphine realized something. The pain was proof of value. You couldn't hurt this much over something that didn't matter profoundly, and Daniel had mattered, had changed her in ways that would persist through all her remaining centuries. 6 months after his death, Seraphine commissioned a monument in the palace gardens. Simple crystalline sculpture with an inscription. To Daniel Cross, who taught a queen to be human. Not accurate, she wasn't human and never would be, but true in the sense that mattered. He taught her to embrace connection despite cost, to value honesty over protocol, to be herself rather than just her title. Years passed, then decades. Seraphine ruled for another 1,000 years, and throughout all that time, she remembered. The human who'd avoided her because he was too impressed to function, who'd confessed that truth when confronted, who'd spent 30 years showing her what genuine partnership looked like. She never formed another connection quite like it. Some things were singular, irreplaceable, but she applied what he'd taught her. Led with more openness, more honesty, more humanity, even as an alien who would live for millennia. And sometimes in her garden, standing by the monument, she would speak to him. Tell him about challenges she was facing, decisions she was making, knowing he couldn't hear but finding comfort in the articulation. "You were right," she said one evening, 500 years after his death. The connection was worth the loss. Even now, even after all this time. The gardens offered no response, but Seraphine felt, perhaps imagined, a sense of approval. Because Daniel Cross had taught her the most important lesson of her 1,200-year life. Avoiding overwhelming connection because you fear its end is just another form of